This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. Director Barry Sonnenfeld has often wondered if he died multiple times and managed in every incident to move to a different multiverse, one where instead of dying, he miraculously lived on in a world exactly like the one he previously lived in, except his father managed to avoid a head-on collision with a tractor-trailer. Barry wasn't killed by muggers on 14th Street and 5th Avenue. He didn't die when his plane crashed at Van Nuys Airport. And most recently, the elk he hit doing 70 miles an hour on I-80, 40 miles east of North Platte, Nebraska, didn't kill him. Or maybe there are no multiple universes, and he's just very lucky. These are the kind of things that the director of the Addams Family, Get Shorty, and the Men in Black movies ponders in life, and in his new book, Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, Memoirs of a Neurotic Filmmaker. And today, Barry joins me on the show to talk about his fight with Larry David over who is the most neurotic person on the planet, his astounding ability to beat any celebrity at leg wrestling, and his secret to making children cry on camera. He recalls his first gig straight out of NYU Film School as a cinematographer on pornos, working with Joel and Ethan Coen on their first film, Blood Simple, and why you never want to receive a cake on a Coen Brothers movie. Barry discusses his difficulties working with Penny Marshall on Big, how Rob Reiner taught him about something called the silent schmuck, and why he and Danny Devito had such a hard time convincing a studio to make Get Shorty. Plus what it's like to work with Will Smith and a bunch of Confederate Civil War reenactors, Eleanor Roosevelt jokes, and more. Coming up with director Barry Sonnenfeld in just a moment. Barry Sonnenfeld is a filmmaker and writer who broke into the film industry as the cinematographer on the Coen Brothers' first three films, Blood Simple, Raising Arizona, and Miller's Crossing. He was also the director of photography on Throw Mama from the Train, Big, When Harry Met Sally, and Misery. Sonnenfeld made his directorial debut with the Addams Family in 1991 and has gone on to direct a number of films, including Addams Family Values, Get Shorty, and the first three Men in Black movies. His television credits include Pushing Daisies, which won him an Emmy, and most recently, Netflix, A Series of Unfortunate Events. Now he's written about his adventures in the movie business and more in his new memoir, Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, Memoirs of a Neurotic Filmmaker. Barry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be here.
Well, you claim that you're not just a neurotic filmmaker, but the most neurotic person in the world. In fact, I guess you even got into an argument with Larry David, of all people, in the middle of a restaurant over which of you is more neurotic. Do you really think that you're more neurotic than Larry David? And what is your case to be made here?
Well, you know what? The restaurant discussion happened after I was already declared the most neurotic. Here's what happened. I know Larry a little bit. We're both friends of Rob Reiner, and we see each other from time to time at Rob's house. And we each sort of wanted to feel like we were the most neurotic person ever. You don't want to be the second most neurotic person. Right. There's no upside to that. And Larry and I had both worked with Cheryl Hines. She had been in RV for me and several other things, and, you know, obviously played Larry's wife on Curb. So we both asked Cheryl who was more neurotic, and she, for years, refused to answer, knowing whoever was declared the second most neurotic would feel it was an insult. But one night she was on the David Letterman show, and she announced that I was the most neurotic person she had ever worked with. Of course, thrilling for me because I won. Cut to months later, and I'm having breakfast, pitching an idea for an animated movie at a restaurant in New York City at the Lowe's Regency Hotel.
Oh, yeah.
It was the power breakfast hotel in New York. In fact, both Barry Diller and Donald Trump, who is not yet our president, were also in the room, and I'm eating breakfast. From across the room, I hear someone yelling at me across the room. It's Larry David, and he goes, Sonnenfeld, you claim you're more neurotic than I am, and you're having eggs with yolks, butter on your bread, and you're eating bacon? And I yell back, extra crispy, across the room, which makes it even more carcinogenic, I guess.
Yeah.
But he felt that no one with the right amount of neurosis should be eating unhealthily. So he felt that vindicated him in some way, but he's totally wrong about that. I still win.
Now, I want to get to why you're so neurotic, Barry. It sounds like your late mother was at least part of the source of your issues, and there's a great story in here that really drives it home. In fact, it's in the title of the book. When you were, I think, 17 years old at a big concert in Madison Square Garden. Can you tell that one? Yes,
the reason the book is called Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, is in early January of 1970 at 2:20 in the morning, and the time is very important, while Jimi Hendrix was warming up for the second time. He had earlier stormed off stage because he wasn't feeling the right vibes. And as Jimmy was about to hit the strings of his guitar, over the PA system came the following message and book title, Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother. So, of course, I start to cry because I assume the only way my mother could get through to the garden, even, answering service and get someone to agree to page me was because my father must be dead. So, wow. First of all, by standing up, I have announced to my section that I am indeed Barry Sonnenfeld. So, very quickly, because we are at the garden, 19,600 people, the chant of Barry starts in the blue section where I am, but it starts to cascade towards Jimmy, towards the orange and red and more expensive seats.
Jimi Hendrix.
By this time, I'm at the payphone in the back of the garden, weeping, calling my mother. I said, Mom, who died? Of course, Mom is weeping too because that's her, go-to position in any situation. Says, I thought you died. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, you said you would be home at 2. It's 2:20. I said, didn't they tell you the concert was still going on? She said, yeah, but they couldn't find you. So that's an example of the surreal, overprotective, only child life I lived. And I think it reflects on the body of my work, which tends to be slightly dark, slightly quirky, and slightly off-center. And I have to thank my parents for that, I think.
Oh, yeah. You could not have written a scene like that for the movies. No one would believe it.
Well, the funny thing is I wanted to write that scene in some movie, and I'm always reticent to tell people because I know someone will steal the scene.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I better get the this memoir sold pretty quickly to some television studio.
Yeah. And you say that your mom was at least partly responsible for your crippling fear of flying as well. Is it true that she once had a panic attack on a plane and convinced a pilot to drop the air masks?
Well, yeah, we were always poor. We rarely had electricity or phone service at the same time. We would skirt Lou the Butcher because we owed him a lot of brisket money. And we always used to drive to Miami off-season. My father would always drive, and he would drive straight through. It would take 30 hours. And one year, he fell asleep while driving through Georgia. We almost got killed. So the next year, Dad mysteriously came into enough money that we could take our first airplane trip ever. First of all, we were flying on Eastern Airlines, but they were out of planes, so they leased the plane from a company called Pan Americano.
Which is not the same as Pan Am?
It's very much not the same as Pan Am. It was a low-budget Mexican airline. So we're on a plane with bilingual pilots and flight attendants. My mother decides partway down that she's having an angina attack and somehow convinces the flight attendants to convince the pilots that the only way they can save her immediately is to drop the oxygen mask. So there we are on a 707, flying down to Miami, the first airplane I've ever been on. And there are 115, masks swinging as we bounce through turbulence with my mother sucking oxygen and me pretending I don't know who she is. It's kind of why to this day, every time I get off an airplane, I view it as a failed suicide attempt. And it adds to the irony that in 1999, I was in a plane crash in Van Nuys Airport that ended up destroying 5 Piper Cubs and a fence, a Dodge Ram 3500 dually, before it came to a stop in a parking lot of Van Nuys Airport, at which point the crew fled the plane and I was left alone on it.
Yeah, didn't the fire department come out and they were trying to get you off the plane before it blew up?
Of course, the fire department comes because they think there's a plane that's about to explode. I'm afraid of heights, so while the other 3 members of my plane, the pilot, co-pilot, and flight attendant, jumped off the plane and fled, and I was not about to jump off the plane until I convinced a specific fireman. You always want the guy with the biggest mustache because every fireman has facial hair, to catch me. But once he did, it was more of a hug than a catch. We all fled the plane, and the plane didn't blow up.
Yeah, so your fear of flying is not totally irrational.
Well, weirdly, it made me a better flyer, because once I experienced what dying in a plane crash was going to feel like, I relaxed because I realized, okay, I can deal with that.
So let's talk about your career, Barry. You didn't start out wanting to go into the movies. You originally wanted to be a still photographer, right? When did you decide that you wanted to get into film?
I decided that being a still photographer would be a fairly lonely profession, and I wanted to find something that involved more people, although I didn't know that it would end up being film. I spent 3 years living at home in Washington Heights and attending NYU Uptown. They had a separate campus in the Bronx, because my mother said that if I went to sleepaway school, others call it college, she would commit suicide. So I spent 3 years at NYU, and my mother just said, why don't you go to graduate film school? You like writing, you like photography. Film is just a lot of still photographs and writing, which, by the way, it isn't. And we'll pay for your 3 years of graduate film school. So I thought, this is great. It's 3 years where I don't have to figure out what I'll do with my life, although I really had no interest in film. While I was at graduate film school, I realized I was one of the 2 good cinematographers there, the other one being Bill Pope, who lived in my building, who went on to shoot Men in Black 3, the early Spider-Man, and the Matrix movies.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up being a cinematographer. The last thing I did is, when I got out of film school, I felt I could declare myself as a cameraman if I owned a camera. And again, this is way before video cameras. So I bought a used 16 millimeter camera for no other reason than I could, without feeling like a dilettante, say I was a cameraman.
Yeah, and after film school, you actually made ends meet by working on pornos, or I don't know if anyone still says pornos, adult films. Not in front of the camera, by the way, but I guess you were, what, a DP or a cinematographer? Do they have cinematographers on adult movies?
I think we would call ourselves cameramen. Because I bought this used 16 millimeter camera, and I bought it with another NYU student, and this NYU student knew a guy who produced and directed pornos. So we were able to get our camera rented for 9 days. It only took 9 days to shoot 9 feature-length, I still call them pornos, and That paid for 2/3 of the cost of buying this camera.
Oh, wow.
Not including the salary we were getting paid as well. It was a truly horrible experience, and I would not recommend being on a porno set to anyone.
Really? What's the worst part about that gig?
Well, the worst part actually is the smell, believe it or not.
Oh,
I always
God.
say that if pornos were released in smell-o-vision, it would destroy the entire industry.
Oh. And I love that you got the bright idea to have a man and a woman have sex in a bathtub full of spaghetti and meatballs.
No, that was not my bright idea. That was
Okay.
Dick's. Dick always had the most unerotic method of shooting any scene. A bathtub full of spaghetti and meatballs. We had a set that we built that looked like a dentist's office, which is another very unerotic,
Right.
unerotic, very neurotic,
sexy.
very unerotic way of shooting porno.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine in what world someone would think that sex in a bathtub full of spaghetti and meatballs would be in any way sexy.
Well, Dick did.
Now, you came up in the industry with the Coen Brothers and were their cinematographer on their first 3 films. What were they like as young indie filmmakers fresh out of film school?
Joel went to film school. Ethan went to Princeton as a philosophy major, but dropped out pretty early on. So Joe was at undergraduate film school. I was at graduate film school, and the two schools, both at NYU, had no interaction. So I did not know Joe at film school at all. But one night we were at the same party, and we were talking, and Joe had told me that he and his brother Ethan, the philosophy major, had written a script for Blood Simple to be shot in Austin, Texas, and they were going to shoot a trailer as if it was a finished movie and use the trailer to raise the money to make Blood Simple. And I told Joel, well, I own a 16 millimeter camera. And he said, great, you're hired to shoot the trailer. So it was that simple. I shot the trailer. It looked great. We eventually made a print, and then Joe went back to Minneapolis, where the brothers grew up. Ethan and I stayed in New York. And over a year of showing the trailer, having meetings, we were able to raise the $750,000 to make the movie, all from individuals. You know, there was no corporate money or anything like that. And $15,000 got you 1 point in the movie.
I wonder, what did that movie gross? Good investment, I imagine.
That $15,000 over the last 20 or 30 years is now paid back probably $75,000 or $90,000 in returns.
Yeah, because I think you said in the book that when you first screened it for the investors, they all hated the movie.
Oh, they hated it. They didn't understand it was a comedy.
Right.
And no, 2/3 of the investors literally walked out of our investor screening.
Wow. Now, I'm always curious, how did Joel and Ethan Coen work together? Do they divide up their duties? Are they just totally in sync? How does it work between those two?
In the old days, they both wrote the screenplay, and Ethan was called the producer and did more of the producing, and Joel was called the director and was the only one who would talk to the actors. Although, if we did a take, as soon as the take was over, Ethan would say, hey, Joel, and Joel would say, yes, yeah, I know, I'll tell him. And it was that
Wow.
symbiotic in their relationship. I've since visited their sets, and Joel and Ethan now both talk to the actors sort of arbitrarily, but on the first 3 movies we did, it was they both wrote it, they both designed all the shots with me, chose wardrobe together, all that kind of stuff. But on the 3 movies we did together, Joel was the one who would speak to the actors, not Ethan.
Yeah. And you and the Coens created something that I've never heard of, this idea of giving someone a cake on your films. What does it mean to give someone a cake?
It means to fire them. It was just our code for we got to get rid of that prop person. We'd say we should give them a cake, and we would buy a sheet cake, and along with firing the prop person or whomever, they would receive a cake. The other thing that
what do you write on the cake? Do you write "We'll miss you" or something?
No. No, we don't want to be cruel. We want to be lovely and give them a cake. We also start our shows. I don't know if Joel and Ethan still do that, but I always start a show on a Thursday so that you can have 2 days to realize, oh my God, that key grip is a disaster and we've got to get rid of them. And you still have the weekend to find someone new and bring them up to speed. So you don't want to start on a Monday.
Now, I also learned another term in this book. You worked with Rob Reiner on When Harry Met Sally and Misery. And I wish that I had known this before because I've had Rob on the show before. He taught you about something in comedy called the silent schmuck.
Well, no, it's not. It's not in comedy. It's in life.
Okay, in life. Okay, what is the silent schmuck?
We all get it. We just never knew there was a name to it. I'll give you an example. If you say, let's say you say to your wife, "Why don't we eat out tonight?" And she says, "Tonight?" The schmuck is silent, but it's there.
Okay.
It's the intonation of the way it's pronounced. The other way you can give someone a silent schmuck is to say, really? The schmuck is silent, but it's there. So what happens is, as a director, you're dealing with a lot of crew people, and you'll say to the hair person, you know what, I prefer picture A where her hair is longer. And the hair person, if she says, the longer one? Schmuck. It's just not spoken. Or really? Schmuck, not spoken. And you'll now discover that throughout your daily life, you'll be given schmucks on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I've been getting it all day long, every day. I'm pretty sure if I propose going out to dinner with my wife tonight, she would definitely give me a silent schmuck under the circumstances.
Tonight I think it wouldn't be so silent.
We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with more when we come back in just a minute. And you were also the cinematographer on Big, and apparently you had a rough time working with the late director Penny Marshall. Why didn't the two of you gel?
I've always been known as sort of a comedy visualist. I think that the camera can be more than a recording tool. It can actually be a character in a movie, or help a laugh, or create a laugh. And Penny was more of a traditional comedy director who sort of didn't trust that the camera can do more than record comedy. So she just didn't like my visual style. And, she told me at the beginning of the second week, with a dozen White Castle hamburgers and a carton of Marlboro cigarettes in her hand at 7 a.m, that she tried to fire me over the weekend, and they wouldn't let her. And I said, Penny, you should have any cameraman you want. And if you're not happy with me, you should fire me. And she said, no, they won't. I say you're no good, but they disagree. So that's who I worked with for the next 11 weeks after that. Someone who I knew didn't like working with me, but I loved working with Hanks. And I got along with Penny, except as a cameraman. We would joke around and have a good time. She just hated what I was doing on the movie, but the studio was happy, so I stayed on.
Yeah, and it sounds like she had a tough time making decisions as well, which, I mean, if there's anything that's the #1 job of a director, you have to be able to call shots.
All a director does is answer questions. That's the entire job, is to have an opinion about everything. No one on a crew wants you to say to them, I don't care, you decide. So when the prop guy brings you a red folder and a yellow folder, you've got to say the yellow folder. You can't say, oh, it doesn't matter, you choose. They just don't want that answer. So all directing is creating tone and style by having opinions about everything. And it's the accumulation of all these little decisions that seem inconsequential at that moment that add up to a director's style and tone. And Penny just hated to make decisions, and I was very happy to make decisions. So it was another thing that I think got in the way of our relationship, is that Penny wouldn't make decisions, and I would make them for her. And sometimes that was difficult for her to sort of accept, but someone had to make those decisions.
And you may be, I think, the only director of photography who didn't want to actually direct, but you say in here that the producer, Scott Rudin, actually convinced you to be the director of the Addams Family. Now, for people outside of Hollywood who don't know, Scott is a little bit of a throwback to the old Hollywood mogul. He's one of these guys who is just a guy with impeccable taste for story and a great eye for talent, but he can also be a total monster, especially if you're one of his assistants. What was your experience like working with him?
What I say about Scott Rudin is I love him and I wish he were dead. And I think most people feel that way to some extent. Scott, as you said, has impeccable taste, is a brilliant person in casting and wardrobe, is incredibly well read, and is a great defender of the film against the studio. And he will make sure the studio spends as much money as he thinks is required to make this movie. Unfortunately, I was a first-time director. In fact, as you said, I was very happy being a cameraman. And I was in LA finishing up shooting Misery for Rob Reiner when Scott Rudin sent me the script and said I should direct it. And I went and met him and said, well, why me? And he said, well, I went to Terry Gilliam and I went to Tim Burton, and they both passed. So all the good directors passed, so I thought I'd hire you. What he really meant was he wanted a visual stylist, and he had been at Fox when I shot both Big and Raising Arizona, and knew that Addams Family shouldn't be a straight-ahead comedy, but should have real visual style. So I said, yeah, sure, if you can get me hired, I'll direct it. Because the other thing is, I grew up with the Charles Addams drawings in the New Yorker, and I loved them because they were so visual, and they had actually the same theory of comedy I had, which was don't tell the audience where the joke is. Don't cut to a close-up. Play a comedy in wide shot and let the audience find where the comedy is. And if you look at Charles Addams's drawings, sometimes you have to look at them for 30 seconds to realize where the joke is.
Yeah.
Oh, it's in the upper left-hand corner. Scott did scream at me, but I figured out early that the way to deal with Scott screaming was to out-juvenile him. So whenever he would yell at me and I would be in his office, I would take apart his couch, crawl on top of it, take all the pillows and build a fort, crawl into the fort, close the last open space with the last pillow, and then yell out, I can't hear you, I'm in the fort. And Scott would scream at me, get out of the fort, Sonnenfeld, I'm really busy, get out of the fort. But he would never invade the sanctity of the fort. He would never pick up a pillow and say, schmuck, there is no fort, get out of here, get out of there, you're wasting my time. Instead, he would say, get out of the fort. And I would say, not until you apologize. And eventually you'd say, all right, I apologize. Get out of the fort. Then I would take apart the fort and we would continue our meeting.
Now, Addams Family is one where you had a lot of studio suits, or at least one studio suit, trying to meddle and get in your way, which is the bane of every director's existence. What's the secret to handling studio interference like that?
Well, it changed. You know, when I was doing Addams Family, I was a first-time director and therefore had A, very little power, and B, very little experience to know how to handle the studios. And over the years, I've become smarter and less angry, to tell you the truth. And now I'm much more willing to hear out the studio's notes and to sort of, instead of saying, that's stupid or that won't work, I'll say, well, that's a really great idea. There's one other way we could try it, and then I'll say something totally the opposite. But Will Smith taught me, actually, don't be negative, be positive. So that's where I've come around to being. But, you know, Addams Family, I should have been pushed around because I was a first-time director, and thank God Scott was there to defend the movie, actually.
Yeah. And one of my favorite scenes from Addams Family is when Angelica Houston as Morticia Addams is, I guess, a kindergarten teacher, and she makes the whole classroom of kids start bawling. My question is, I mean, kids are notoriously difficult to work with on set. How did you get a bunch of kids to cry on cue like that, Barry?
I'm not proud of it. It was
Okay.
a difficult day. I'm shooting Angelica, trying to reading Hansel and Gretel from the witch's point of view, and at the end of her reading, she says to the kids, "How do you think that would feel, children, to be put into an oven?"
Right.
And the kids are supposed to cry, and I know I'm never going to get a bunch of 5-year-olds to cry, so I say to the kids, okay, look sad, look happy, look worried, cut. I think we got it, Scott. And Scott said, you don't have it. Those kids have to cry. If we don't have a scene, if you don't get those kids to cry. And I said, you want me to get a bunch of 4 and 5-year-olds to cry on cue? And Scott said, you're the director, Barry. Those kids have to cry. Go make them cry. I go back and I tell the cameras to start to roll. And this is where the story gets particularly hideous as it relates to me. And I say to the kids, all right, kids, we're all done. You guys did a great job. The only thing we still have to do before you go is that each one of you children need to get your measles shot. And this one cute kid with curly hair said, and they were all blondes, by the way, because that's what we wanted, the comedy of Morticia, this dark-haired woman talking to all these little cute blonde kids. This one curly-haired blonde kid said, oh, he's only kidding. And I said, oh, no, didn't your parents tell you? It's like a known thing whenever you're on a movie set. You have to get a measles shot. It won't hurt, don't worry. And that kid starts to cry, which is a signal to all the other kids, because he was their leader, that they should start to cry too. So all the kids start literally, legitimately crying because I told them that they were going to have to get a measles shot. It was horrible. And one of the parents, seeing what was happening, chased me out of the door, out of the schoolroom, down a corridor. I raced into the station wagon waiting for me. And we drove away as the guy was screaming at me, chasing the car.
Yeah, I mean, only Scott Rudin would force you to make children cry.
Well, that's very Scott, but he was right. And the scene is
hilarious,
and it's all due to Scott making me do it.
And by the way, to this day, another film of yours, Get Shorty, is still one of my all-time favorites. You say in here that one was really a bit of an uphill battle. You couldn't find a studio that even wanted to make it. Why not?
Well, there were 2 reasons why no one wanted to make Get Shorty, and it took Danny DeVito and me almost 6 years before the film was made and released. One, until Get Shorty, there had never been an Elmore Leonard adaptation of one of his novels that made money. The second thing is no one wanted to make movies about Hollywood, and Get Shorty is about Hollywood. So between a movie about Hollywood and an Elmore Leonard book being turned into a movie, no one wanted to make it. Every studio passed. Some studios lost their chairman, got a new chairman. We'd go back to them. They passed. Danny had an overall deal at TriStar. TriStar passed twice. And eventually, because Danny's agent was skiing at Deer Valley and found himself on a chairlift with a guy named Mike Marcus, who had just been named head of MGM, and MGM needed material, that we were able to make the movie. And Mike gave us a list of actors who we'd make the movie with. They all passed. Dustin Hoffman, Warren Beatty. Beatty took a long time and made me spend 5 days in the Hotel Bel Air in L.A., but I eventually realized he was going to pass.
Really?
And,
he was just jerking you around?
Well, certain movie stars want to be pursued, like beautiful women, even if they don't want to have sex with you. Yeah. So Beatty wanted to be pursued, but I realized he was never going to make it, and I eventually got on the plane back to New York. And Jersey Films, which was Danny's company, had just produced Pulp Fiction. The movie wasn't out yet, but they suggested Travolta, and my wife thought it was a brilliant idea. I had 2 meetings with John. He passed twice. And luckily, Quentin Tarantino, who's a friend of Jersey Films, called John and said, John, this is a great script. This is not the movie you pass on. So Quentin convinced Travolta to be the lead in Get Shorty.
Wow. Now, is there any truth to the rumors that the Danny DeVito character in Get Shorty is actually based on Dustin Hoffman?
I will say that one of the people who we were pursuing to be Chili Palmer, the lead that was eventually played by Travolta, was Dustin Hoffman. And I took Hoffman to lunch, and Hoffman said, so Barry, am I the shorty of Get Shorty? Because he had worked with Elmore Leonard years earlier, and I guess it was a nightmare for Elmore. So it could be that Dustin Hoffman is the shorty of Get Shorty. But I said, Dustin, I really don't know. And he said, well, listen, I'm not going to do your movie anyway, but it's nice to meet you. And typically, you're supposed to then talk about it and say why he would be great in the role. But instead I said, okay, well, thanks for the meeting. And I paid for the cup of coffee for him and me and left.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago what a positive person Will Smith is. You did 4 movies with him, all 3 of the first Men in Black movies, as well as the Wild Wild West. What's the best thing about working with Will Smith?
Will is an upbeat person. Karmically, you just sense his karmic energy. I could be on one end of the stage. Will could walk in on the other, which is 150 feet away, won't say a word, but Will is on the set. He's a real partner. He has great ideas. He is great looking. He sort of understands what I'm looking for in comedy, which is that no one should be funny. They should just be real and let the situation be funny. And he's really smart with story. He's a great asset to work with.
When you were shooting Wild Wild West, I was interested to read that you actually used Civil War reenactors instead of regular extras. I have to think that must be a pretty interesting crowd to work with, huh?
Well, the good thing about Civil War reenactors is that they come in their uniforms and they bring their own muskets and stuff, so you save a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they kind of know what they're doing, but on the other hand, that becomes annoying because they're sticklers for their rules about, I wouldn't say that line because I'm a sergeant. He would say it because he's a lieutenant. And yeah, I know, but you're in the Union. He's an extra. Can you say that? Well, then I should be wearing his clothes. Okay, fine. Let's put that jacket on. So it was a real nightmare. We only had them for one night. We were up in Lake Piru, which is northeast of L.A., and it's always cold. Typically, this is another story about Sweetie. She had been dizzy for a day or two, and I convinced her to go see our L.A. doctor, and I was leaving for this night shoot with the reenactors as she was coming home from the doctor. And I said, what did the doctor say? And she said, well, the doctor, Coblin, the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with me, so he wants to do a brain scan just to make sure I don't have a brain tumor. Wow. And she said it trying to make me relax, but of course I hear brain scan,
sure,
brain tumor.
Yeah.
So I now know that Sweetie is dying. It's just that simple because I always go to 11. So I'm on the set. It's taking forever to light. It's cold. I'm hungry because you don't eat until 6 hours after the call. So lunch is going to be at midnight. Will comes to the set and he says, how you doing? I go, well, I'm not doing well, Will. Sweetie has brain cancer, and I start to weep. He's weeping uncontrollably. We're both, because Will has known Sweetie for years now, we're both weeping, sobbing. The producers see this and put both of us onto a flatbed of a John Deere tractor ATV and whisk us off the set past 400 Confederate reenactors staring at the Jewish guy and the black guy hugging and weeping. We get back up to where all the campers are held away from all the crew and extras, and we get off the flatbed, and I say, well, you know what, Will, maybe I'm just hungry. And he says, what, Baz? He used to call me Baz. And I go, well, maybe I'm hungry. And he says, what are you talking about? Your wife has brain cancer. And I go, well, we don't know that for a fact. Right now, she's only been dizzy. But what about the tumor? Well, I don't know that there is one. Tomorrow they're going to take a brain scan. I think she's probably fine. You want any food? So Will is so furious at me. I then go to my camper with my meal, and the producer, Graham, who's my good friend, has already started to eat his food, and a piece of cauliflower has gotten stuck in his throat, and he is actually dying. He can't breathe.
Oh, wow.
I don't know the Heimlich.
Oh, my God.
So I race to Will's camper, and I yell, Will, Graham's dying. And Will says, I'm not falling for that again, Baz. I go, no, he's really dying. You got to come quick. Will runs over with me back to my camper. By this time, Graham is purple. I said, Will, do you know the Heimlich? He goes, no, but we got to do something. And Will picks Graham up by his legs like he's a newborn baby and starts swinging Graham into the camper's refrigerator like a pendulum with Graham upside down. And he's swinging him so hard that eventually Graham's back hits the fridge one last time. A rosette of cauliflower pops out. Graham can breathe again. Will puts Graham on the ground and says, white folk, silent schmuck, and leaves.
Wow. Now, Will is also one of the many celebrities that you have beat at something called leg wrestling. You are a champion leg wrestler. For anyone who didn't grow up in the Northeast in a certain era, what is leg wrestling? Who are some of the people that you've competed with, and have you ever lost a match?
Now, you're talking to someone who's physically inept. I can barely walk, right? You know,
Okay.
But I learned I have this amazing skill at leg wrestling. So this is what leg wrestling is. You and I lie down on the floor with our hips aligned with each other, and your feet on one end and my feet on the other.
This
It's sort
doesn't
of like
sound
thumb
homoerotic
wrestling.
at all, Barry.
Yeah, exactly. It's like thumb wrestling or arm wrestling. So
Okay.
you and I then lift our legs up 3 times towards the sky, and on the 4th time, we wrap our legs around each other, and I try to take your leg and flip you, and you try to take my leg and flip me. It's not a pretty sight, I admit it.
This sounds like it. Now, have you ever gotten an erection during a leg wrestling session, Barry?
No, it's always been my leg.
Okay.
But I've never lost, and I've played Will Smith, Usher, Kelly Ripa, who actually knows how to leg wrestle and is also
Really?
incredibly competitive. Her husband, Mark. I was on Kelly's show about a week and a half ago, and when we went to a commercial, I leg wrestled both Gelman and Ryan Seacrest, and I beat both of them to flip them instantly.
Wow.
I've never... Patrick Warburton, who's a big guy.
Yeah.
Neil Patrick Harris, various cameramen, grips, electricians, tennis pros. And here's the secret, because everyone says, "Oh, I figured out his secret."
Yeah.
And they think that they figured out. They watch the video. They'll videotape me and watch it over and over again. My secret is total anxiety. While everyone else is flexible and relaxed and works out and has, works on their hamstrings, my leg is a steel rebar of stiff pain and anxiety. So my secret is that I'm totally inflexible. So my leg is like a steel rod, and that's all it takes. So the more anxious you are, the better you have a chance of beating me.
I love it. Well, this has been so much fun. As we wind up here, one thing that comes up a couple of times in your book is how you would cheer up your depressed mom with Eleanor Roosevelt jokes. I've never really heard an Eleanor Roosevelt joke. Before we go, can you take us out with your favorite one?
So here's my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt joke. Eleanor and Franklin are out on a Sunday drive. You know, it's in upstate New York. It's a beautiful day, and Franklin has realized that he hasn't paid any attention to Eleanor, so they're in the back of an open-air car, driving along. They've got the chauffeur up front, and Eleanor says to Franklin, notice anything different about me? And Franklin is already dreading the whole drive, and he says, nice shoes, Eleanor. And Eleanor says, these shoes, I've had them for years. I was married in these shoes. And he goes, oh, new dress. It's a beautiful dress, Eleanor. And Eleanor says, are you kidding? This is my everyday dress. And Franklin goes, oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. New gloves. Eleanor says, new gloves? These are the gloves I used to milk our cows. And Franklin, just fed up, says, I give up, Eleanor. What's different about you? And Eleanor says, I'm wearing a gas mask. See, the joke is Eleanor was not a pretty woman.
Oh my God. This was so much fun. And the book is just such a fun read. Again, folks, it's called Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, Memoirs of a Neurotic Filmmaker. Barry Sonnenfeld, thanks for talking with me. This was a blast.
Pleasure, Ben. I'm glad we were finally able to do it. I'm sorry we weren't in person, but I had a great time.
Thanks again to Barry Sonnenfeld for coming on the show. Order his new book, Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, Memoirs of a Neurotic Filmmaker, on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at @KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.